we're on Matthew 6:22.
Yeah,
So we're still in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. I think maybe we'll finish the Sermon on the Mount today, which goes through the end of chapter 7. And then the beginning of chapter 8, the narrative starts again with Jesus's early ministry. So 6:22. The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? All right, so when it says here, this is an interesting phrase. When it says if your eye is good, the Greek word is aplous, which means, even in modern Greek, aplos means simple. So it doesn't, and if you look at the definition of aplous in the ancient text, it means if therefore your eye is good, it means actually single. It's single or simple. So therefore it means without guile, sincere, straightforward, without a hidden agenda. So, and it came to mean in Jesus's time also generous, someone who sees things generously. And a bad eye would mean either a diseased eye or a stingy one. So there's the sense of being sincere. If your eye is sincere, straightforward, without a hidden agenda, generous, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, stingy, your whole body will be full of darkness. And in the ancient world, they had this idea that light actually was emitted from the eye. Light actually came out from the eye rather than light coming into the eye. So that's why it says, therefore the light that is in you is darkness. How great is that darkness? Meaning that you produce the light that allows you to see. And if you have darkness in you, then you can't see. All right, 6:24. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. All right, so here you have this idea that a slave that's shared by two masters, which was uncommon, but it did happen sometimes through joint inheritance. So let's say your father had a slave and that was his property that he owned, and he died and he passed it down to two of his children. The slave would actually have two masters. And he's saying that this doesn't work because it leads to divided interests. Either you'll pay attention and obey the orders of the one and ignore the other, or vice versa. And then he says, what he's likening this to is you cannot serve God and mammon. And mammon is an Aramaic word, which is Jesus's native language. Mammon was a word that meant possessions, wealth, money. And so Jesus seems to be personifying this idea and making it like an idol or an idolatrous god by personifying mammon. And this was common in the ancient worlds, like in the surrounding region, the Canaanites, who the Israelites were supposed to drive out, but who continued to surround them. Their god of death was called Mot, and Mot, even in modern Arabic, means death. So the god of death was named Death. So here you have this idea that there's this god of wealth, almost Mammon, and that we can by serving Mammon, by serving the interests of wealth and money, we actually become like that which we are worshiping. Right. So
mammon could be anything that we make our God.
Yes, yeah, it could be, yeah. So here, here it literally means money or wealth, but it seems to be anything that becomes an idol for us. Therefore, I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? So this was actually kind of something radical to say to Jesus's audience, because most people in antiquity had little beyond the basic necessities of food, clothing, and shelter, and often their eating each day depended on things that were beyond their control, like seasonal rains or the flooding of the Nile. So they actually had a lot of reason to stress about, one bad spell of weather could mean that they don't eat. So they actually had quite a bit that they had to be concerned about, and most people didn't have multiple sets of clothing or food that was built up for several days. They lived day to day.
Is this, so the Greek there starts with the dia tuto,
Yeah,
tuto? So like, but because of this, so is this like a direct link back? Is this sort of explaining what serving
yes,
well looks like?
I
Is
think so.
Sort of a preoccupation with
Yeah,
material.
via tuto means, yeah, like for this reason, therefore, yeah. Do not worry about your life. Don't serve mammon. Concentrate on serving God. And that's what he's gonna get to in the very next line. So don't worry about these material things. Instead, think about your Father. 26. Look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, which are all things that humans do to eat. Yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? Which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature? So this is called a Calva Homer argument that Jesus uses often, which means how much more. So if the Father takes care of birds, who don't take care of themselves, they don't build up food or sow or reap or gather into barns. If the Father takes care of them every day, well, how much more will he take care of humans who are the crown of his creation? And then he says, which of you by wearing can add 1 cubit to his stature? So the cubit was a measurement. And this seems to be referring to Psalm 39. And Psalm 39, it refers to the handbreadths of one's life. So a handbreadth was the width of a palm. And I think 6 handbreadths made a cubit. So he says here in Psalm 39, Lord, let me know my end, and what is the measure of my days? Let me know how fleeting my life is. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is as nothing in your sight. Surely every man stands as a mere breath. So you have this idea from the Psalms of, this life being measured out, and handbreadths or cubits. And Jesus is saying, who can add even 1 handbreadth or 1 cubit to his life by worrying? 628. So why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies. Yeah,
I I probably know the answer to this, but I want to get some more enlightenment. I read that verse and then I think of people starving everywhere. How do you put those two together?
which verse are you talking about?
Where it says, "Don't worry, your father feeds the birds," and what you
Um, yeah.
a whole little area there. I mean, there are people starving in the world, and I always get in a conundrum when I read this verse and then see what's happening in the world. And I just wonder if I know we have to take it on faith, and I understand that, but where do you bring those two together?
Yeah, boy, that's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't blame God for the situation. I would blame man because there's more than enough food that's grown in the world to feed everybody, and that they've proven that. It's just that we don't distribute it properly, and we don't take care of the hungry. So I would say it's more on us as humans rather than God. God provides the food. We just don't get it to who it needs to get to.
Well,
You
that's
think
a
it also,
great answer. I'm glad I asked the question.
Yeah.
do you think it also has something to do, like when Jesus says, don't worry about tomorrow, tomorrow has its own, or will worry for itself. It's not denying that there's worries, it's more of your relationship to what's coming over the future.
Right.
Is it maybe some of that in there too, is not necessarily about the clothing or the food, but our disposition towards those things.
Right, and even if you are starving, if you're hungry, what good is worrying gonna do about it, right? So,
That's where your son on Sunday, it was your son and Monday.
Father.
I was hungry and you fed me.
Right,
That's where it's our responsibility to
Right.
feed the hunger.
yeah, exactly,
No, I like the way you said it is our responsibility. God provides, and we just to make sure it needs to get where it needs to go, I guess.
yeah, good question. All right, verse 28. So why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. And yet I say to you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Now, if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? All right, so here when he says the lilies of the field, it's not clear that it's lilies actually. Some people think that it was actually probably the flowers that he's referring to in the field are scarlet poppies and purple anemones. Especially the anemones, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, which were purple because the purple and then the red to a lesser extent would have reminded people of the color of the royal robes of Solomon. And so they think it was these flowers that Jesus had in mind, the purple and red flowers. But in any event, the whatever flowers they were ended up being used for kindling in women's bread baking ovens. So after the sun dried them out and parched them out, they would use them to start fires. So all of this was burnt up. It ends up being nothing.
It is the poppy because in Palestine and stuff, they're fields. You look out and they're fields of
Yeah.
red poppies all over the place.
Okay.
But it is the flower of Palestine, the poppy.
I didn't know that. Okay. All right, 31. Therefore, do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For after all these things the Gentiles seek, the pagans. For your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. All right, so that ends chapter 6. Now at the beginning of chapter 7, we go into do not judge. 7:1. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. So if there's a parallel saying in Luke where Luke talks about filling something up to the brim. So with this standard of measure, what we're supposed to think of is in the marketplace, they would have standard measures. So if you were to go to buy a pound of, or whatever the unit was, a pound of wheat, let's say, they had a bowl that equaled 1 pound. That was the measure. And if you measured it like that, you had a rounded top and it was overflowing, then you were generous in how you measured. So he's saying the way you measure is the way it'll be measured to you. So if you measure generously, then God will measure generously with you. And then he continues, why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So it's interesting here, the father's comment, a lot of the commentary focuses on when he says, do not judge so that you will not be judged. That he's not forbidding judging altogether, but he's saying first look at your own faults before you look at the faults of others. I mean, of course, we have to be able to judge that something is right and wrong, right? In order to have that discernment, that there's some judging involved, but we shouldn't judge in the sense of going first to our brother. We should judge ourselves first. So St. John Chrysostom explains, one had best not pretend to counsel another when one has the same fault unexamined. And then we have this more clearly in James, the epistle of James 4:11. He says, do not speak against one another, brethren. He who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge of it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who's able to save and to destroy. But who are you who judge your neighbor? So he's saying that we're not in a position of being judges of the law. Only God is judge of the law. We are in the position of being doers. That's what we should do, and we should start with ourselves. And when he says hypocrite, he's referring to the Pharisees. And then so he continues then in 7:6. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. So what he's probably saying in the immediate context is Jesus's teachings are the pearls. and don't throw them before the Pharisees who were critical of Jesus. Later, like from very early on, though, from the Didache, with this early Christian document from around the year 60, interprets this phrase as referring to those who are unbaptized, preventing them from partaking in the Eucharist. So very early on, the Christian tradition interprets this phrase as the pearls equal Holy Communion. And in fact, the word there, your pearls, are margaritas in Greek, which means pearl. And interestingly, when we're serving the liturgy, and we take the body of Christ and we break it up and we put it in the chalice, sometimes there are slight crumbs that fall on the antimetion, this sheet that we lay out on the altar, and we can very carefully gather them together and put them into the chalice. And those little pieces, those little crumbs of divine communion are called margaritas, are called pearls. So it's the church's tradition interprets this phrase as referring to the Eucharist, but in the immediate context, it's probably referring to Jesus's teachings. All right. And let's see, what does it say? Pigs and dogs were considered unclean animals, which had no appreciation for valuable things. Pigs typically ate the vilest foods, and dogs were scavengers, consuming even human blood. Stray dogs were known to growl at those who tossed them food, as well as those who ignored them. The image would thus be forceful and beyond dispute for ancient hearers. All right, 7:7. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. Or what man is there among you who, when his son asks for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? So the idea is Jesus is comparing God as our Father, and he's saying, what human father is there who, if the son asks for a loaf of bread, will give him a stone instead? Or if he asks for something even better than bread, if he asks for a fish, he won't give him a snake, will he? So you being evil in comparison with God, if you know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will our Heavenly Father give what is good or good gifts to those who ask him? In Luke, in the Gospel of St. Luke, he has a parallel passage, and there he says the Father in heaven, it doesn't say we'll give good gifts or what is good, he says we'll give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him. So Luke tells us what is good, the good gifts that we are awaiting from the Father are his Holy Spirit. Let's see. All right, 12. In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. So this is the famous golden rule. And it's been noted that Jesus wasn't the only one to teach something like this in the ancient world. In fact, in the Jewish book of Tobit, Tobit is part of the Orthodox Old Testament, but is not included in the Protestant Old Testament. But in the Jewish book of Tobit, it says in 4:15, do to no one what you yourself dislike. So it's the negative, it's the inverse of the golden rule. But all of this is coming from Leviticus 19:18, where it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's the Old Testament basis for the saying, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. So a lot of times rabbis would give summary statements like this and say, for this is the law and the prophets, meaning here's the most important principle or one of the most important principles out of the Old Testament, so that you can, if you understand this, then you understand the spirit of the rest of the law and the prophets. In 13, he says, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it. And Jesus, in Luke's gospel, it's the disciples who ask Jesus, are there few who are to be saved? And this is Jesus's response to that question, are there few who are to be saved? Because remember, at this time, the Jews really thought that God was interested in saving them, and that the Jewish people, by being the chosen people of God, were going to be saved by God. And so this idea that Jesus is throwing out there that, well, if you don't follow my teachings, there's a chance that you won't be saved, actually, even if you are Jewish, if you don't follow me as the Messiah. So this scandalized people, they couldn't understand. Are you saying that there are some Jews who won't get in? And he's saying, yes, that is true. And he gives this image of the two ways. So there's the way that leads to life and the other that leads to death. So, and this is common from Deuteronomy. This is how Moses framed the challenge to Israel in Deuteronomy. There are two ways. One, that obeying God's commandments that leads to life, and the other, disobedience of God's commandments that leads to death. And we see this in the Didache, for example, that the early Christian document I was talking about also talks about the two ways. So this image of there being two ways would have been familiar to Jesus's audience. Then he continues, and he's talking about the Pharisees here. Beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. So in other words, these
Route to Cracker
Pharisees.
Barrel Old Country Store. Proceed to Winfield Drive.
Who's going?
Hal, are you going to the store? I'm just kidding.
I'm not even on, Father. I'm on, so that wasn't me.
Okay.
Sure.
All right, so he's talking about the Pharisees here as false prophets, and many Jewish people at this time thought that the string of prophets had ended, that God wasn't giving any more prophets to the Jewish people, although they didn't necessarily believe that there were still prophets coming. Jesus, to many of them, seemed like, wow, this guy could maybe actually be a prophet. But many of them, even though they didn't necessarily believe that God was still providing real prophets, they did believe that there were many false prophets. And Josephus, who's a Jewish historian in the first century, mentions many of them. Many of these false prophets, who usually what would happen in the first century, there was all these uprisings being led by these Jewish rebels, Jewish revolutionaries, trying to start a revolution against the Romans. And many of these false prophets, led people into insurrection, rebellion against Rome, and led them really into death, because the Romans would just come and crush them. And this happened often in the first century. That first century was a time of really turmoil, with the Jews trying to throw off the Roman overlords. So Jesus considers the Pharisees to be the false prophets. And the definition of a false prophet is someone who leads people astray, leads people away from God. And he says, you will know them by their fruits. The false prophets. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles, are they? So thorn bushes and thistles were considered obviously worthless. They're talked about often in the Old Testament, whereas grapes and figs were considered the finest of the fruits, the most popular. So every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then you will know them by their fruits.
Is there a distinction between, like, does false prophet carry the connotation of like intentionally leading astray?
I don't think so. I don't think it has to be intentional. They could be sincere in their beliefs, but it's judged by whether it ends up leading people closer to God or further from God, regardless of their intention. Interestingly, the rabbis at the time allowed that a prophet a real prophet had the authority to temporarily suspend the teaching of the law, in the same way that the rabbis themselves could. But if a prophet denied the law itself, which they accused St. Paul of, for example, or advocated idolatry, they were false prophets. Jesus teaches that if they do not live right, they're false. So the criteria is how they live.
I'm thinking of like false teacher.
Yeah,
I've always made the distinction, like, we're fallible. Like even
Right.
the saints, like they got it wrong in some
Yeah.
areas. But you wouldn't call them a false teacher for having gotten it wrong, but someone who willfully teaches the wrong thing would be
Right,
false. I guess my question strikes more, is there a higher standard for the prophet than the teacher?
right.
In terms of false or true?
Yeah, that's a good question. Huh, I guess you gotta look at it by their fruit, whether they lead people to God, sometimes, the saints can lead us toward God, even if occasionally they might misspeak.
Well, what about the people that live a wicked life and
Right.
don't do anything good? They don't bear good fruits.
Are you,
But
are you worried about yourself?
Yeah. I am very much, yeah. No, but bottom line, at the last, if you go in to see someone sick that's always been evil and you have a prayer with them and they accept God at that time.
Yeah.
What happens with that? How does this relate to that? They've never done anything good.
Good, right. Well, now they can though. Even if the tree doesn't have time to bear fruit, it can still become a good tree. That's the power of our repentance. That even if, because we would say, for example, the thief on the cross, he repented, truly he repented, but he didn't have time to bear any fruit. But nevertheless, he was accepted into paradise. So, yeah, that's the kind of scandalous bit about Jesus, is that even at the last minute, he accepts.
Last second.
Last
Yeah.
second, yeah.
And also, I mean, you just used the guy on the cross, as to explain, well, he is bearing fruit. It's just not bearing fruit within us.
Yeah, but it's the fruit of his lips, they would,
Right.
the fathers would say, the confession of faith that he makes is.
And that's what we believe in, the
Yeah.
confession of faith, even at the last minute.
Yeah,
At that time, what does the priest do with the person that does like that?
yeah, usually, I mean, we don't have, in the Roman Catholic Church, they have last rites. We don't exactly have last rites, but we would apply, it's called extreme unction. So, unction basically at the end of life, so we would, so it's kind of like a last rites. We would read the prayer of forgiveness and apply unction to them, yeah.
It's like the Emperor Constantine became Christian on his deathbed.
Right,
Isn't that right?
yeah, he was baptized on his deathbed, yeah. Yeah, that wasn't uncommon at that time.
It was or it was not?
It was not uncommon at that time, especially for someone with political power, because, they would have to make decisions that, a decision to go to war or not to go to war, which, sending people to their death is a sin. And so they would consider it inappropriate to be baptized and then have to make those kind of decisions. So they wanted to wait until after so Constantine waited until basically he had given power over to his sons, and then he was baptized. All right, let's see. 721. So he's in the context here of talking about these false prophets. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. So it's not just what we say. Jesus is concentrating again on what we do. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. So this quote, and depart from me, you who practice lawlessness, is from Psalm 6. And it's about the vindication of the righteous. So just showing deference to Jesus isn't enough. The disciple of Jesus must keep the teaching and the will of the Father. This is the ultimate criterion. Do you do the works of the Father? Are you producing good fruits?
And that's why we believe grace, we're saved, but your works have to go hand in hand.
Yes, yes. We have to cooperate with God by his grace, but also with our human freedom. 24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. So the rabbis in Jesus's time actually among the many strange debates that they had, there was actually a raging debate among the rabbis about whether hearing the law was more important or doing the law was more important. And most of the rabbis concluded that hearing the law was more important than doing the law. Why? Because you can't do something without first hearing it and learning it. But Jesus here is coming out strongly on the side of doing the law is what's important. 28. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as scribes, meaning the Pharisees. So when Jesus, as one having authority, usually rabbis would teach, when the rabbis would teach, they would quote rabbis who had gone before them, famous rabbis who had gone before them. This was, and it's still common in modern Judaism. They would say, Rabbi so-and-so said this, Rabbi so-and-so said this. Kind of like how we would say Saint John Chrysostom said this, Saint Basil the Great said this. We wouldn't just speak out of our own, we would be citing someone as a source, right? As our authority on this. But Jesus doesn't cite anybody. So unlike the rabbis of his time, he's saying that these are he has authority. He teaches as one who has his own authority, and not like the Pharisees who would quote their predecessors. And when it says, when Jesus had finished these words, this is actually the same formula that appears at the end of each of the 5 major speeches in Matthew. So at the end, there are 5 major speeches scattered throughout Matthew's gospel. And they're supposed to kind of correspond to the 5 books of the Old Testament. So Matthew is presenting Jesus as a new Moses, right? So just as Moses authored 5 books, Jesus offered 5 sermons that kind of also incorporate or encapsulate the whole law. The formula is based on Deuteronomy 32:45, where it says, when Moses had finished speaking all these words to all Israel. All right, so that concludes the Sermon on the Mount, and we see that Matthew is presenting Jesus as a new Moses. So the same thing happens here. Now we're going to enter chapter 8. In chapter 8, so you had the narrative of Jesus's birth, you had his baptism, you had the temptation in the desert, and then immediately he gives the world's greatest sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, and now it really begins to go into the narrative of his ministry, his early ministry. And what Matthew does in the next couple chapters is he groups together 9 stories containing 10 specific miracles. So that's what's going to happen next. So there's actually 3 miracles at the beginning of chapter 8, which we're going to start on now. Then there's a teaching on true discipleship. Then there's 3 more miracles at the end of chapter 8 into chapter 9. Then teaching on true discipleship again. And finally, there's 3 more miracle stories, one of which includes 2 miracles in chapter 9. So there's 9 miracle stories, one of which has 2 miracles, so that there's 10 specific miracles that are going to be recorded in the next 2 chapters. Why? Some people see again here that Matthew is presenting Jesus as the new Moses, because what does Moses do? There's 10 miracles that take place to try to convince Pharaoh to let his people go. So Jesus, like Moses, Jesus is going to perform 10 miracles here. And ancient writers used examples to illustrate points. So Jesus' authority over sickness, demons, and nature summons people to recognize his authority over their lives. In ancient thought, miracles could call attention to or attest teachers or their views. People in power viewed mobile teachers, itinerant preachers with followings of large crowds as threats to social stability. The Romans were always concerned about uprisings in Jewish Palestine. I was talking about all these false prophets that were constantly leading revolution attempts. Readers familiar with this situation might recognize here a hint of impending conflict when it says that all these large crowds were following Jesus. All right, let's see. So Matthew 8:1. When Jesus came down from the mountain where he was speaking the Sermon on the mountain, large crowds followed him. And a leper came to him and bowed down before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one, but go, show yourself to the priest and present the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. So leprosy obviously is a skin disease, which the Old Testament in Leviticus 13 had commanded that they be quarantined from the rest of society. They were exiled from the rest of society. They couldn't have any contact. And in fact, they were supposed to shout. They lived in their own kind of leper colonies. And when non-lepers would pass near where they were staying, they were required to shout out, leper, leper. Unclean, unclean, actually, is what they would say, so that people would steer away from them. So lepers were outcasts from society. And when he says, when this leper comes to him and says, Lord, Lord can also just mean sir, just like it in modern Greek when we say, O Kyrios Tave, oh, Mr. So-and-so. Kyrios can mean Lord, it can mean sir, it can mean Mr. It's a term of respect. It doesn't always have to only mean Lord in the exalted sense of Jesus as our Lord. So this leper comes and addresses Jesus with deference. He prostrates himself before him, meaning he goes down to the ground and puts his forehead on the ground, which was a sign of extreme respect for another person's dignity or power. And then Jesus touches him to heal him, and touching a leper was forbidden by Leviticus 5:3. And most people would have been revulsed by the thought of touching a leper, but Jesus does it. So, and this based on, if you go back to like Second Kings, when lepers were healed, the healing of a leper was considered a major miracle in the line of a prophet, right? So Jesus is showing himself to be kind of in the line of a mighty prophet like Elijah.
Is it also like I guess the purity codes are typically like impure things make pure things impure.
Right.
And then Jesus is kind of turning that on his head, so pure things make impure things pure.
Yes.
It's kind of a reversal of that.
Yeah,
formula.
because he touched it, so therefore it becomes pure. Yeah. Instead of the other way around, instead of him becoming impure.
It's kind of the reverse of the woman with the flow of blood.
Right. Right, yeah. Same thing happens there. She touches Jesus, and through that touch, she's made pure rather than him being made impure, which is normally how they would have viewed it. If you touch someone with leprosy or you touch someone with an issue of blood, you were made impure, and then there was a ritual you had to go through, including a ritual bath, a mikvah, in order to be cleansed again. All right, and so then he concludes by telling him to follow the law, which was the priests were kind of like the health inspectors. The priests had to verify whether the leprosy had indeed been cleansed, and then they had the power to restore them to society, that they could go back to society once it had been confirmed that they were healed. And there was also an offering of thanks that was to be made that Moses had commanded in the Old Testament. So in some ways, Jesus is respecting the law, and in other ways, he's turning the expectations of the law on its head by disobeying the law by touching a leper. But he has a special exception, right? Because he's not affected in the same way that normal men are affected. He actually imparts holiness rather than taking on impurity. All right, and then we'll go to another story here, and starting with 8:5. And when Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, imploring him and saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. All right, so Roman soldiers, to get an idea about the centurion. So the centurion at this time, the biggest unit of Roman soldiers was located in Syria, up to the north and east of Israel. But there was probably we know that there was a detachment of Roman soldiers in Jerusalem, at the fortress in Jerusalem. And that there was probably at this time a small detachment of soldiers in Capernaum, because in Capernaum was like a customs station. It was like a border crossing. So there were customs officers there. So probably the centurion was in Capernaum to oversee soldiers who were regulating trade. And a centurion implies that he had 100 soldiers underneath him. But at this time in history, we know that they actually had about 80 troops underneath them. And these centurions were like, first lieutenants, second lieutenants, captains. They were the backbone of the army. They're the ones that made the small groups actually, work. And so the centurions were actually paid 15 to 60 times more than the enlisted troop. And these centurions would typically have to commit to 20 years of service, and during that 20 years of service, soldiers were forbidden by the Roman army to marry or to have families. But many of them would take unofficial wives and have children. But so anyway, you have this sense of the centurion was able to have, even if he didn't have a family, he would have slaves because he was paid so much more that he could easily afford to have slaves, and the slaves would be kind of like his family. So he cares for the slave who's fallen paralyzed at his home. And for this reason, he goes to Jesus and asks him for help. And Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. But actually, there's two ways you can read this in Greek. It's either a statement, I will come and heal him, or it's a question, shall I come and heal him? It doesn't really matter all that much, but if you read it as a statement, it declares Jesus's willingness to cross an important boundary, a cultural boundary, because it seems that pious Jewish people would not enter Gentile homes. Because they were considered impure. So that if you entered a pious Jew entered a Gentile home, you would have to go through this ritual again to be made pure. And we see this with the religious leaders when they tried to crucify Jesus. They didn't want to go into Pilate's home in order to bring Jesus to trial because they were afraid it would defile them. Let's see. So Jesus says, I will come and heal him, or shall I come and heal him? 8. But the centurion said, Lord, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who were following, truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. I say to you that many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So here, this is a pretty amazing thing that Jesus says, that because you have this image of the future banquet in God's kingdom, and the Jewish people of this time and the Jewish literature emphasized that this banquet was prepared for Israel, and that Israel would be exalted over its enemies. But here he's saying that people will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, these paragons of Jewishness, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Gentiles, non-Jews, will eat at table with them. And remember, for Jews, just like you couldn't enter into a pagan house and not be defiled, you couldn't eat with Gentiles, you couldn't eat with pagans. And here Jesus is saying, in the kingdom, in the banquet, the paragons, the paradigms of Jewishness are going to be sitting down and eating with Gentiles who are going to be in the kingdom. And some of those Jewish people are not going to be there. Because he continues in 12. So after he says that they will come from east and west, meaning outside Israel, and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. 12. But the sons of the kingdom, meaning the Jews, will be cast out into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And Jesus said to the centurion, go, it shall be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed that very moment.
Did Protestants believe that all Jews are saved?
Richie, can you speak to that? I mean,
No,
They do not just,
No,
they
well, I
believe
mean-
the Messianic ones will be saved, or
when you say Protestants, it's kind of like the first that you're saying, like the Jews believe this, there's really a plurality of belief,
Yeah.
certainly in Protestantism, but many are who are like deeper into Protestant theology would say it's saved by faith alone, through grace alone. So there's not an opportunity for salvation outside of
faith.
ascension to that belief.
it just wasn't, I guess it's that the majority of them believe that Jewish people can do no wrong, no matter what they do.
Well, there's especially in evangelicalism, there's a pretty strong like Zionism that
Yeah.
Oh, yes,
that's like almost like a fetishized Zionism. But it's not that distinction, that's almost more of a political stance than it is
Yeah.
like a theological stance, although it is backed by some pretty shaky theology. But with the brass tacks of it, if you got down to the actual theology of it, it's still faith alone, grace alone.
Yeah, I had at the festival in October. We get people coming in, all kinds of people coming in to tour the church, and usually, they'll ask something like, when you can tell that they have no idea what Greek Orthodoxy is, they'll ask something like, well, do you believe in Jesus? Do you believe in the Bible? Basic questions, and we say yes, yes. And this one lady, the first thing she asked, you could tell she wasn't clear at all whether we were Christian. She just wanted to make sure we're Christian. And the only question she asked was, do you support Israel? That was for her the criterion of whether we were Christian or not. And I just thought, wow, that's so interesting. I mean, it's much more political than
Yeah.
theological.
Yeah.
But there is definitely something
Yeah,
there.
just something, yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is tied to again, a really shaky eschatology that says basically our salvation is tied to the future of Israel.
Right.
Which is kind of the Tim LaHaye,
Yeah. This was,
great,
How did you-
planet Earth. Right?
How did you answer her, Father?
I told her no, we don't support the modern state of Israel.
Did she leave?
Yeah.
Go, Father.
Yeah. Yeah. That was interesting. I like what Father Andrews said about, it's not that we're against Israel, but we treat them like any other country on earth. We want all the countries of the earth to come into the church and be saved, but the church is the new Israel, not the modern state of Israel. Yeah.
It's the Zionist questions that are the root of it all.
Yeah,
And that's well, we don't need to get political here, but that's why they claim they have the right to be in the West Bank and everywhere else, because it's the oldest, anyway. Another time, Father, another time.
Yeah.
and I mean, ITA at some seminaries for a Messianic Jewish scholar who would very much support that same claim that she's not Zionist, she doesn't believe that, so it's easy to paint with a wide brush there, I think, but she doesn't support the current state of Israel. She is Jewish.
There's a lot of Jews that do not, yeah,
Right.
because they think it's forbidden to have a state of Israel until Christ comes for
Can I
them.
borrow your book? My notes ran out. I didn't think we'd get this far. All right.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Where were the Jewish people supposed to go? Because in my reading, they asked to come to the United States and it was rejected.
Right.
Supposed to go.
Right.
But the Palestinians welcomed the Jews because they were Jewish Palestinians. They welcomed them. And they didn't have a problem with living with them, but it's when they take over all of the land and try to eliminate Palestinians, that's what's wrong.
Yeah, I don't think it wasn't, you make a good point. Where were they supposed to go? But on the other hand, why do the Palestinians have to suffer for the Jews' problem?
England should have opened their doors, the United
Right.
States should have opened in Germany.
Right. All right, so let's see, I think we're on 8:14, yeah. 8:14. Now, when Jesus had come into Peter's house, he saw so they're in Capernaum, and if you go to Capernaum to this day, you can go to the spot where they say where Peter's house was. Now when Jesus had come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother, his mother-in-law, lying sick with a fever. So he touched her hand, and the fever left her. Again, he touches. And she arose and served them. When evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word, and healed all who were sick, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, He himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. So Matthew is showing here in this series of miracles that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the one that was prophesied in the Old Testament. All right. 18. And when Jesus saw great multitudes about him, he gave a command to depart to the other side. So Capernaum is on the Sea of Galilee, on this lake, Sea of Galilee. And he commands to depart to the other side of the sea. Then a certain scribe came and said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Then another of his disciples said to him, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead. So there's this teaching in between the first three miracles and the next three miracles. You have this teaching about what is true discipleship with Jesus, and he gives a pretty stark idea of what it means to be committed to Jesus. But Jesus himself has nowhere to lay his head. He has nothing, but he's asking us to follow him. All right, now back to the miracles. 23. Now when he got into a boat, his disciples followed him. And suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea, so that the boat was covered with the waves. But he was asleep. So he's in the boat, sleeping. Then his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, Lord, save us, we are perishing. But he said to them, Why are you fearful, O you of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. So the men marveled, saying, Who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him? All right, and this leads us into the famous story of the demoniacs, which we read 2 or sometimes even 3 times a year on Sundays.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Jesus experienced everything we experience.
Yeah.
Temptations, emotions and all that, right?
Yeah.
But he didn't experience fear.
Right. Yeah, interesting. Well, I mean, yeah.
It just hit me, that's all.
I mean, later in the Gospels, he does seem to experience fear with, the passion and
The passion
in the
and
Garden of
take the cup
Gethsemane.
away from you, right?
Right, so it's not that he's immune to it, but
Yeah.
in this particular case, he doesn't seem fearful.
You,
I'm gonna look up something. There's something in here. The significance of him sleeping in the boat is interesting. And there's something important there, but I can't remember what it is. I'll look it up for my notes for next time. All right, here we go. The demoniacs, the Gergesene demoniacs. 28. When he had come to the other side, to the country of the Gergesenes. So if you imagine the Sea of Galilee, I think Capernaum is on the west side, I think. And so then they crossed over the sea to the east side. To the country of the Gergesenes. There met him 2 demon-possessed men coming out of the tombs, exceedingly fierce, so that no one could pass that way. And suddenly they cried out, saying, What have we to do with you, Jesus, you Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time? In other words, before the end of time, before the end of time when God will judge all things. So they recognize exactly who Jesus is. This is the first time that people recognize who Jesus is. People up to this point think that he is maybe a prophet of some kind, but it's the first confession of faith is from these demons, actually. They know exactly who Jesus is. So demons believe, they just don't bear any good fruit. Now, a good way off from them, there was a herd of many swine feeding. So the demons begged him, saying, If you cast us out, permit us to go away into the herd of swine. And he said to them, Go. So when they had come out, they went into the herd of swine, and suddenly the whole herd of swine ran violently down the steep place into the sea and perished in the water. And it's interesting. That's exactly how it is. I've been to this place. It's in northern Jordan, near the border with Syria, and you can see that there's the city is up on this kind of hill, and then there's a valley down with a slope that goes pretty steeply down into the valley where the sea is. So you can kind of picture, if you're standing there, you can picture these pigs, standing around the city or on the slope of the city, and then all of a sudden just going down the steep slope into the abyss. And like Father Andrew was saying at the retreat, the water represents the abyss. It represents chaos. So they go back to where they came from, in other words. Then those who kept them, the pig herders, fled, and they went away into the city and told everything, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they begged him to depart from their region. So I think and we'll stop there. That's an interesting phrase. So Jesus comes, he performs this miracle. There's two guys who are demon possessed. No one can even go near them because they're so extremely violent. He heals them, but he also, in healing them, he destroys this herd of pigs, and people want him to go away. You would think they would say, please come and stay here and heal us more, but why? So some people speculate it has to do with the pigs, because the pigs are unclean for Jews, so Jews wouldn't raise pigs. So the significance of crossing the Sea of Galilee and going over to the eastern side with the Gergesenes is that these weren't Jewish people. So there's a whole question here of whether there was a mix of Jews and non-Jews in this area. So there's a question here of whether they were non-Jews who were legally and tending to the swine, or whether they were Jews who, for monetary reasons, were taking care of pigs even though they weren't supposed to. That's not clear. But in any event, they're upset about the financial loss of these pigs, and that's why they ask him to leave, beg him to depart from the region. So it's an interesting question for us of, when Jesus comes, do we want him to be here? Do we, when Jesus's teachings are applied to our country, do we want him to be involved in our country? Do we want him to be involved in our region? Or will we beg him to depart from us because he's disturbing our love with the demons? We've gotten comfortable with the demons. All right, so we'll start on chapter 9 next week.